Nice.
Yeah.
I'm sure everybody is clapping. Yes. Thank you so much. That's great. I can't believe so first of all, my name is Brian Moon. I'm the Associate Director here at the CTL. We're very glad to have lots of familiar faces and lots of new faces. As you may or may not know, Scott Phillips, the director at the CTL, is also, and myself, we both have backgrounds in music, and I'm surprised we haven't thought about having musical entertainment prior to workshops before. So maybe this is something we need to, to look into. Thank you so much. There is a poll going to help get to know you guys a little bit better. So if you don't see that, you should see that popping up. Want to thank you for joining us for a workshop this afternoon. Just a few quick things. All of our workshops are different for content, so our settings are different. So for this workshop, just so you're not confused about your settings, we currently have our chat disabled only to go to hosts. And so we do have a lot of hosts. This is a panel. There'll be a lot of discussion, lots of good input. But we do ask if you have questions, send those to Brianna Bryan. She is a host. You should see her there at the top. Otherwise, if you send questions to a panelist, that may not be seen. So any questions, send that there. Your microphones are muted. You cannot unmute yourself. That's fine. I think the nature of the workshop, we have a panelist, so that's not an error. You cannot unmute yourselves, but feel free to send questions via the chat. I also know that if we can't get to all questions, that they will follow up with you via email as well. So enough from me. One final thing, since we have a few new folks here, if you are working towards a CTL certification, I'm looking through the names. I don't see this case, but if you ever attend a CTL workshop and your username is not something identifiable, whether it's your Blazer ID, first and last name, something like that. If it's not identifiable, be sure to let us know. But I think everybody here at this point is in good shape. So now I will mute myself and I will turn it over to Brianna. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, Brian. And thank you so much, Dr. Marson, for those musical stylings. That was so good and a really excellent way to kick us off today. So I'm watching the poll results come in, and it looks like we have a few other musicians in the room, a few guitar players, a couple other harmonica players. So I think next time we'll have to start off with another jam session. Okay, so it looks like everybody is in the room. So we'll get started. So hello, welcome. I'm Brianna Bryan. I'm the marketer for the Bill L. Harbert Institute for Innovation and Entrepreneurship. And on behalf of my colleagues, let me get that next screen. On behalf of my colleagues who you see on the screen and our partner over at the Center for Teaching and Learning, I thank you for joining us for the first part of our Commercialization for Academics webinar series. So today we're going to be highlighting 5 UAB researchers who are successfully leveraging intellectual property. And it's a really great group. We're super excited to help amplify their stories and hear their insights. So we'll also share an overview of the UAB innovation process and hopefully inspire you, our viewers, to recognize new potential paths to commercialization for your own research. So a couple of notes before we begin. Many of you submitted questions for our panel beforehand, so thank you so much for that. But as Brian mentioned, you can now virtually ask a question during the program by submitting it to me in the chat box on the top right. And we'll try our best to get to all of those following the initial panel discussion, but if for some reason we can't address everybody or we run out of time, we'll address those in the course recap that I'll email out to everyone shortly. All right, so with that, I'm going to hand it over to our licensing associates, Scott and Sat, to kick off the panel.
Okay, thanks, Brianna, and welcome everyone. We'll start off with Dennis Pillion. Dr. Pillion is professor in the UAB Department of Pharmacology. He joined UAB in 1979, and in collaboration with his colleague, Dr. Elias Mizan, he has developed a novel compound for non-invasive delivery of drugs and biological vectors. Through licenses and patents from the HIE, this compound has been developed by a pharmaceutical company, or a couple of them, into a nasal delivery formulation that's known as Intravel. and it's just recently received FDA approval for intranasal formulations for various drugs. So a little factoid, some may recognize Dennis's name from his son's byline. His son is the natural resources reporter with AL.com. So Dennis, well, unless you brought your harmonica today, I'll hand it over to you to share the story of Intravel.
Thank you, Scott. It's kind of fun to be introduced as someone who's the father of someone else who's probably more famous and more important than I am. That's a new one. I'm a basic scientist, biochemist by training, and so I have an interest in treatment of diabetes. And so back in the early 90s, we were interested in seeing if we could get nasal delivery of insulin or glucagon to become a reality. And there had been some people who did it before using bile salts, and what they found was that it did work, but it caused a lot of nasal irritation. So we had the idea of using a mild detergent, something like baby shampoo, to put in there and increase drug absorption from the nose. And what we found was that it would work with some reagents, but not others. And so we had basically a beautiful storm there. We had an effective way of getting drugs delivered, but also it was not obvious why some worked and some did not. So we went into investigating why some worked and others didn't. And so that really was the basis for submitting a patent application. And we worked with the UAB Research Foundation to get a patent approved. And then after that approval, then we worked to license that technology, and a group out in San Diego was formed to take that, and they in turn sub-licensed it to a number of other companies. So that kind of in a nutshell describes the background of how Intravel got started. And now it's being used for drugs that are not insulin, not the ones that we initially investigated, but it's being used for a number of other chemicals, including diazepam, and that's being used now to treat epileptic seizures. So we're excited to see that kind of development take place.
All right, thanks, Nick. All right, next up we have Dr. Dan Marson, who generously performed with us with his passion for harmonica, as you just saw. Dan is a clinical neuropsychologist, professor in the Department of Neurology at UAB. He directed the department's division of neuropsychology for over 20 years and the UAB Alzheimer's Disease Center for 10 years. In 2009, Dan developed a series of what he calls financial capacity instruments, FCIs. These are tools for measuring cognitive impairment and decline in patients progressing toward Alzheimer's disease. Dan is also a licensed attorney and obviously a talented harmonica player. So Dan, it's yours.
Okay, well, thank you, Scott. And so my story with the UAB Research Foundation really begins in the 1990s. I started at UAB in 1990 in the Department of Neurology. I've been there ever since. And I came with a law background, and I was informed that I needed a research program, and I thought it'd be very interesting to study loss of competency in people with Alzheimer's disease. And I started looking at medical decision-making, but in the later 90s, became very interested in how financial skills are lost over time in older adults, particularly older adults with dementias of aging like Alzheimer's disease. Obviously, there are very significant consequences to this to patients and families. And I developed a series of instruments to help me assess patients that I was encountering, and also ultimately became part of my research program at UAB. And the financial capacity instrument itself was developed in the late 90s, an hour-long, very extensive tool for examining a range of financial skills in older adults. And we submitted that to the UABRF as an invention disclosure document. So we were interested in disclosing and also protecting these through copyright as we develop them. And then, as Scott had mentioned, in 2009, we developed a short form version of that financial capacity instrument, the short form, which took about 15 minutes and not over an hour. And that tool has really become a very, it's become a very popular tool for, or increasingly popular tool for clinical trials and also clinical applications. So people are interested in an instrument that's short, that covers a range of financial skills quantitatively and precisely, and that can be used in clinical trials or can be used by clinicians in everyday practice. We had the good fortune in around 2017 to have the instrument used in a major Alzheimer's disease research trial called ADNI, Alzheimer's Disease Neuroimaging Initiative, with about 60 different sites using the instrument. And then we had a pharmaceutical company, Janssen, used the instrument in a clinical trial that was testing an actual pharmaceutical agent. That was about a year or two later. And we're having increasing interest now from a number of different pharmaceutical companies in an instrument that was originally developed just to try to help study loss of financial skills in Alzheimer's. So over time, my relationship to the UABRF has really deepened as I have needed to enter, or UABRF itself has entered into relationships with pharmaceutical companies and NIH grants and things of that sort. And probably about 2 years ago, my wife and I formed a company called Financial Cognition Assessments that looks at one piece of this sort of market, if you want, for the instrument. And we're marketing the instrument to clinicians, whereas we're leaving the sort of the larger scale work for clinical trials with the UABRF and with UAB as the entity that helps negotiate that with these larger firms. So that's my story of really coming in as an attorney, trying to develop a research program, developing a series of instruments, working closely with the UABRF throughout, and then in greater depth and in more complexity in the last 5 years.
Hey, this is Sat. So I'm here to introduce Dr. Pete Anderson, who's a professor of pathology and is also director of pathology undergrad education at UAB. So in addition to being a phenomenal researcher, which has led to securing several patents, and the most notable one will be the drug-eluting stent, he has used his experience in teaching students to study and use the principles of pathology from his lectures and lab experiences to develop the pathology education instructional resource, which is PEER, which is a digital library which is online and has open access repository for hundreds and thousands of images. As of now, I think I saw about 35,000 images that are being used for medical education. So third parties, including editors, authors, documentarians, filmmakers, they would request permission to use PEER images for both educational as well as informational purposes. And I'm happy to welcome Pete to this discussion.
Thank you, Seth. As he mentioned, I have had a research lab and have been active in basic science research, but my side job is as an educator. So, you know, I don't admit this very often, but when I first started teaching, it was taking a lot of time away from my lab research. So I came up with an idea of developing a resource, teaching resources, digital teaching resources to help me teach easier and for me to use as a little carrot. So when I asked other faculty to teach for me, they couldn't say, oh, hey, I don't have any slides to teach pathology, because I could say, well, I've got 30,000 slides on my website, so you can't say no to me. You have to teach for me. So the PEER website started as, you know, a mechanism for me to coerce my colleagues into participating in the medical education program. And then as it grew and as people started using it, I started seeing that, well, all of my friends in other schools want to use these images too. So that's when I went to the UAB Research Foundation, and they helped me work on this to develop the patents and the different protections that can be afforded to a large database like this.
as a basic scientist, myself particularly, and probably most of us, don't have any training in you know, copyright or intellectual property or any of that. So it was very helpful to you know, have the help of the Research Foundation to be able to, you know, protect the images, and actually, because of the copyrights, it's actually easier to distribute the material. Most people think of copyright as a way of impeding what you do, but in fact, you know, copyright law comes from the original US Constitution, and it's the whole purpose of copyright is to promote the progress of science and useful arts by securing for limited times to authors and inventors the exclusive right to those respective writings and discoveries. So every time I try and go to somebody and say, hey, can I use that slide in my database? They're afraid to give it to me, but I say, well, we're completely copyright protected, so nobody can steal the slide from you because it's all protected. And the copyright or the peer website is, you know, keep in mind that this is a medical education or a health sciences education website. So it's not like we get hundreds of thousands of hits every day, but we get quite a few hits, you know, hundreds and thousands of hits. And, but if you think about the number of people that are teaching medical students and allied health students around the country, around the world, you know, the percentage is not so bad. So the little, you know, my great idea to make my life easier by developing the peer website has turned into now sort of a lifetime adventure of keeping up with new technologies. We now have online virtual microscopy, online teaching materials. So with the COVID crisis, you just come to the peer website and, you know, you never have to go to class because everything's digital.
Now back up one slide to Dr. Carney. Well, I'll proceed. We're at Ashita. So I'm happy to welcome Dr. John Carney. Anyone who has studied immunology or knows much about B-cell biology, John will need no introduction. John is a professor in the Department of Microbiology at UAB. He came to UAB in 1973 after completing a Ph.D. in dental sciences at the University of Melbourne. At UAB, he came here to do postdoctoral work in what was then called the UAB Institute for Dental Research. So seminal work by John's lab in the 70s simplified the generation of monoclonal antibodies, and John is recognized as a pioneer in monoclonal antibody technology. A byproduct of the many antibodies developed over the course of his research career as tools to support his research program is a collection of hybridoma cell lines that produce antibodies. And these antibodies have been licensed to several antibody companies for several years and are in use throughout the globe by research by laboratories, both, you know, commercial and non-commercial. So right now, the HIA continues to license John's hybridoma lines non-exclusively to these companies. And as a result, his antibodies research tools are disseminated worldwide. So I'll hand it to you, John.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, okay. Yeah, so thanks, Scott and other organisers for allowing me to be on this webinar. As Scott mentioned, I was fortunate very early in my career to take a quick early sabbatical. I went to Cologne and learnt hybridoma technology, which I then brought back to UAB for the first time. We've been working with the Herzenberg laboratory at Stanford. Len Herzenberg is credited with inventing the fluorescence activated cell sorter, and he'd been working closely with B. Becton Dickinson. So they saw the advantage of using monoclonal antibodies with disorder. And so we licensed our first antibodies, which were anti-human antibodies in, I think, 1984. And also some to Southern Biotechnology Associates, which is a small company in Birmingham, which is very high quality and still exists. These, as he said, these antibodies were made for our initial research programs, but we've been fortunate to license them to many other people. At the beginning, we were pretty altruistic, and the personal royalties that we got, we put in to buy a very expensive cell sorter. This practice was stopped somehow by, I don't know why, for tax reasons. Microbiology share of these royalties now go into my fund in the department to support my lab. Fortunately, together with UBRF, we insisted that these licenses be non-exclusive, because after BD, many other companies sprang up as licensing monoclonal antibodies, and so we could license the same antibodies to many different companies. We've licensed about 35 different antibodies to different companies. They were garden type kind used as byproducts when we're trying to make special antibodies, but as Scott said, they are used routinely all over the world in research labs and in clinical diagnostic laboratories. Hybridomas and monoclonal antibodies were a huge breakthrough which revolutionized basic research, and many are used for successful treatment of human diseases. But more recently, the swing has been towards recombinant antibodies, where antibody genes from antibody-forming cells have been isolated and converted into recombinant antibodies, which can then be manipulated a lot more easily. However, the already licensed hybridomas will be used by these companies to pull out the genes from there instead of reinventing the wheel. So this has been a very successful collaboration with UABRF long-term, and I hope it keeps going, as long as I've got a pulse.
So last but not least, Dr. Ashita Tolwani is Professor of Medicine, School of in the Department of Nephrology. She's well-known internationally and a recognized leader in the field of continuous renal replacement therapy. She developed a patented citrate solution called Prismocitrate 18, which is safer than other citrate solutions that are currently available, and they can help patients who can't tolerate regular dialysis and instead have to use CRRT without having the issues of clotting. So right now it's being used in multiple countries, including Canada, India, Singapore, Australia, and New Zealand. And in the US, it's in the process of obtaining FDA approval for use. Over to you, Ashita. Ashita, you're on mute.
Thank you, sorry about that. So I am both trained in critical care and nephrology. And so my area of expertise is in dialysis methods for patients who are unstable to tolerate regular dialysis. So basically my focus is on a type of dialysis treatment called continuous renal replacement therapy, which is a dialysis therapy that runs 24 hours on these patients who are very ill, whose blood pressure won't tolerate regular dialysis. As with any type of dialysis therapy, unfortunately, you need a blood thinner to prevent the machine from clotting. And typically what has been used as the blood thinner of choice is heparin, but unfortunately this has systemic manifestations in the patient and can cause them to bleed. So it's not recommended in critically ill patients. So therefore, during this time, about in the early 2000s, the thought came that we could use a regional anticoagulate that can basically make the machine work without clotting, but still have effect where it doesn't will not affect the patient, let the patient clot. And this was a thing called citrate. Citrate's been used in blood banking for years, but the formulations that are available have electrolytes that are very dangerous for patients and causes a lot of complications and specialized techniques to use. So essentially as a clinician, all we did was think about, or I thought about how we can make that process simpler. And I'm a mathematics major by my trade in college. And so I came up with a very simple formulation that was essentially physiological to the patient's levels and what could be used extremely safely with dialytic therapies. We had great success with it. The UAB used it as our standard care, actually, and used it on patients, obtained a lot of data and published that data. And at the same time, I was told by some friends that it'd be really good to patent this since it was very important and very useful and practical and safe. So I patented, published the results, and with the results, I had people all over the world email me about trying this technique. I had a company called Gambro that's expertise is in this type of therapy contact me about the solution after reading about it. They had a solution they made in Europe which didn't have the same concentrations as we did and was not as safe. So basically they requested a meeting with me, flew down from France, learned about our solution, was convinced that it was safe and the way to go. And then basically we licensed it to them, which is now Baxter. And they have utilized and produced that solution called Prismocitrate 18 all over the world. And currently we are in the process of getting it FDA approved in the United States. What becomes very important for our patients right now with COVID is many of these patients develop renal failure and require this special type of dialysis in the ICU. And we have noticed that these patients with COVID are very hypercoagulable and clot. And so even with other techniques such as heparin, et cetera, we cannot get the circuits to run, but actually with citrate, this formulation that we use is more effective. So it's been something that it's been exciting for me to see how it can help patients all over the world.
Super, thanks, Ashita.
Okay, is it time for some questions and answer sessions? I have a question for Dennis. Dennis is a life science investigator. Seeing, especially when you're developing a therapeutic product that has to navigate through the regulatory process to market, I just want your comments on what is that like, seeing the fruits of your work finally make it to market, and how did your relationship with the UABRF or the licensee, did that impact your research at all? Was there any collaborative aspect to that?
Yeah, thank you, Scott. and it's a case of being very patient sometimes in terms of getting a drug approved by the FDA. As I say, we started our studies in 1993 on this topic, got a patent in 1997, got a licensing deal in 2004, and then had first clinical trials done in 2018. And then the company that was licensed our product was just two men. And unfortunately, one of them died of a brain tumor last year. And so they decided it was time to allow another company to buy them out. And so they were bought out by a company called Neurelis. And they are the ones who had been testing our drug for the delivery of diazepam for epileptic seizures. And in this particular case, the situation before our drug, which is a nasal spray, became available, people were using a rectal cream of diazepam in order to treat a child having a seizure. And if you have any kind of experience as a parent, treating a child who's having an epileptic seizure with a rectal cream is not going to be very user-friendly, either for the child or for the parent. So the idea of now the materials that we worked on in our lab being used in that way, and it's something that our laboratory never investigated, epileptic seizures. We basically studied these reagents for the delivery of peptide drugs, and the patent covered the delivery of basically all types of drugs. And our relationship with Aegis was fascinating. What they did was they sub-licensed to each individual company the ability to formulate their particular drug of interest with our detergent. So one company is studying the effect of nasal epinephrine. Another company is studying the effect of nasal naltrexone. And so we're looking at things all across the board. Another company is looking at hydromorphone. So we're looking at pain relief. We're looking at compulsive alcohol disorder. We're looking at epileptic seizures. We're looking at migraine headaches. Essentially, any type of a clinical situation where you need a rapid response. And so, trust me, the way we started this research was very much more narrowly focused on insulin delivery. And now what's evolved is an approach that's useful in a lot of different clinical situations. So along the way, I've learned a whole lot about a lot of other diseases besides diabetes as I've gone along for the ride on this. And I was not involved in the laboratory after I did the basic research on which particular types of reagents would be most effective. So, and there's kind of that shield between a basic science investigator and the clinical researchers who have, and they don't want basic scientists, obviously, to do clinical research per se, because we'd probably get in a whole lot of trouble if we did.
Okay. Dan, I have a question for you. You know, you and I mentioned yesterday, and Pete mentioned, touched on this about the value of protecting your written materials. And it's not to impose a barrier, it's to allow freedom of the exchange. But you've been recently, it seems like the interest in this instrument is increasing when you are now working part-time. So I'd like for you to comment on that, as well as what was tell me about your decision to form an LLC and the types of activity or licensing activity you've been doing from that, independent of the UABRF.
Okay. Well, first of all, you know, one of the rules, if you're an attorney in background like I am, you don't want to represent yourself because you have a fool for a client. That's the old joke. So even early on when I was creating these instruments, I really realized that I needed to have formal copyright protection. And although I could say that I created it and therefore it was copyrighted, I really needed it formally recognized by UAB. And also because I was a UAB employee, it was going to be owned by UAB anyway. And I, as an inventor, I would have an interest in it, but I would not be the owner. So there are a number of reasons why I wanted to come forward and do an invention disclosure document. And I really just feel much more secure in terms of dealing with others by saying it's owned by the UAB Research Foundation. I'm happy to help you, you know, pursue this in any way you're, you know, interested and sort of facilitate the process. But as an individual researcher and clinician, you just don't have the bandwidth to be also, you know, serving as your sort of your own representative and marshaling your resources regarding an invention. So it's just been very helpful to have the UAB Research Foundation there as the owner, which they would be anyway, and sort of assuming some of the roles that I just don't have time to do myself. So that's the protection aspect. And of course, sometimes if you need a patent or a trademark, the UAB Research Foundation will actually put forward the legal costs to do that. So it's something that I don't have to do and I don't have to worry about. They will go out and get the legal expertise needed for that. So those are all good reasons for why you need to seek out protection for your inventions through the UAB Research Foundation. As for my LLC, I think that was a product of where I was developmentally with my inventions and the fact that we had sort of carved out the clinical trial piece of this for UABRF, but there was the clinical application with individual clinicians. And that was something that my wife and I thought we could handle and that the UABRF was not well equipped to do. And so forming an LLC and then being licensed by the UABRF to carry out these sales was, I think, a good business move.
Thanks, Dan. Pete, I have a question. You know, let's stay on the same topic as copyright. You know, people know that copyright is very underrated. So for other inventors who are watching right now and who could be watching, what piece of advice would you offer to them in terms of copyright and copyright protection? And also for your lab and research, how was copywriting your images helped you?
Well, thank you. And I'd have to you know, agree wholeheartedly with Dan's comments about, you know, copyright and the help of the UAB Research Foundation and the Harbert Center for, I'm an academic. I don't, at least Dan's a lawyer. I'm not even a lawyer. I'm just an academic. So I know nothing about law and I know nothing about money, which my wife doesn't appreciate, but going into academics, you usually don't do it for money. So having somebody that'll help protect your rights and help you negotiate and things like that it's very helpful. So as I mentioned, with the COVID crisis, and even before then, the development of online teaching materials, the Harbert Center has helped in negotiating with several companies that we're working with to license our images for them to use for teaching health professional students. And that's something that, would be totally out of my wheelhouse. When somebody calls me up and asks me about it, I just give them Sat's number and say, he's the one you need to talk to. If you want to ask me about the pathology of in the images, I'll tell you. But if you want to know anything about licensing and developing, the commercial components of it, I let Harbert take care of all that. And as far as what this has done for me and our research lab and whatnot, it's always a interesting discussion when I talk to my chair, because there's not a huge income stream that comes through this. But I tell my chair that, you go to almost anybody at a pathology meeting anywhere around the country and ask them about, images and teaching, and they'll say, oh yeah, all our students use the peer website. So I was actually fortunate. My previous chair, his son went to California to go to medical school, to a prestigious medical school, and he came back during Christmas break and said, oh yeah, all our faculty and staff use the peer website for our teaching. So so that helped me stay funded for a while.
Thanks, Pete. I have a question for John Carney. John is exceptional as far as our research tools inventors. I know John has had some patents along the way, but none of these research tools require patent protection to monetize. And they can be licensed over and over and over again, non-exclusively. And of course, we've benefited from John's reputation in the biological sciences and the fact that people will read his papers and they want to use the same antibody clone that's published. And so it's kind of a self-perpetuating benefit for UABRF. But so as a result, there has been significant income over the many years resulting from our antibody licensing revenue. But I'd like John just to comment on the impact of the licensing of his antibodies and the distribution of them so broadly. What impact has that had on your research program over the years? Whether financially or for notoriety. John, you're on mute, John.
UAB has always been known for studies of antibody-forming cells, B cells. The UAB, we think, stands for the University of the Almighty B cell. So we had a reputation straight off. And so these monoclonal antibodies, which we really poured a lot of energy into, we had enough sense to leave or keep the ones which are just garden type ones. And so that's where our source of income comes from. I wish we could get more, but it seems to go somewhere else most of the time. But I'm grateful, and the department's grateful, so that we get a good cut of that, which we can use to do our research. So the reputation is one thing, and also the quality of the antibodies has also been well considered by other people around the world. And it's surprising to me that people they look at the website, UABRF, where all these antibodies are listed, and still people from Europe or companies from Europe are still licensing these, and it's kind of amazing to me why they're doing that, but I don't care, neither do we, I guess. So it's continuous, self-perpetuating for some reason. Maybe they're good antibodies.
Thanks, John. I mean, yeah, everyone can do with a little more income, right? So staying on that topic, Ashita, you have a generous and fantastic way where you sort of directed the royalty that you get, right? So just talk to us about what are some of the ways that you're using that?
So just to start off with, I'm primary clinician, and I really had no idea that this would become something that I would patent and be available all over the world. The Research Foundation really helped me with that. I basically had a problem clinically and solved it with what I thought was a completely common sense way that I didn't think was particularly novel, and little did I know that it would have this impact. And so I wanted the Innovation Fund, which we've created here at UAB, to give an opportunity for other people like me who may not have much of a background in terms of research, et cetera, who comes up with an idea, a practical idea, and to be able to explore it by offering or giving them funds for some sort of innovation when it comes to kidney areas or kidney research, and fund them for a year to be able to develop whatever project they want that would result in a patent and would be able to go through the Research Foundation to guide them to have success too.
Super.
Well, shall we open this up for questions from either any of the participants here or the panelists themselves? Let's see.
Or maybe bump it to Sat if he's ready.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I guess if we have missed anything that the panelists want to share, you guys can go for it. Or other way, if you could just talk about how, you know, the research and the IP part of it, how do you think is going to evolve for you guys in terms of from lab to market? It's very rare when it comes to life science investigators. So in terms of the path forward and your interactions with our office, can you sort of highlight that a little bit? And this is to anybody who wants to talk about it.
This is Dan Marson. I'll offer just a quick point in the area of assessment instruments, which of course is what I've been focused on. I think the phenomenon of COVID and telemedicine is transforming our clinical and research lives. And I think the concept of remote assessment, which has been an idea in the past, and there's been certainly efforts to develop that, is really going to become much more prominent. And so in clinic evaluations will continue, but maybe at a much reduced level as people prefer quality remote assessments that are done through web platforms that will be developed over time. So that's a change I see in the particular area that I have been developing things in.
And this is Pete Anderson. I just want to kind of echo what Dr. Tolwani said, that oftentimes investigators, you're just doing your job. You're just doing the next step, the next experiment. And it just seems logical. And it seems so logical that everybody else would have thought of it already. But that's not always the case. You're in the weeds with your research or your clinical duties, and you're doing stuff and just trying to get work done. And by having this opportunity with Harbert Center and whatnot, to look at some of these ideas that are they marketable? Are they patentable? Are they things that maybe can be of use? And again, it's just like with Ashita, it wasn't for personal gain or to hide it or to say, hide it from anybody or keep it to yourself. The whole idea of copyright and patent is to protect your interests, but by protecting you, it allows you to then disperse your ideas and get them out there, get them into clinical use, sooner and, help benefit society. So I've been fortunate in education. Education doesn't make much money, but all of the chairs of pathology, including my current chair, Dr. Neto, support pathology and support pathology education. And so I've been able to stay alive and stay employed as an educator these last few years because of the commitment to education and the ability of our peer website and the other things that we do to kind of, put this isn't actually University of the Almighty B cell, this is UAB, and we do more than B cells, we also do medical education.
I'd just like to say that UABAF does a really good job at disseminating the available, in our case, these hybridomas, because honestly, I'd lost interest in these many years ago because they were just stuff that we'd made and we'd used and moved on. But they are very efficient at replying to requests for these antibodies, monoclonal antibodies. And I just want to commend them on that, on their efficacy in doing that. I was very pleased with that.
Sure. The antibodies are just probably our most prolific research tools here, primarily because of John and Max Cooper, his former collaborator, who was formerly at UAB. But that applies to any research tools, plasmids, cell lines, bacterial strains. We have the gamut of these to some degree. And of course, some of these are, if, you can just a conversation with us and we can determine whether or not we can commercialize it. I mean, obviously if there's third-party rights to those, then either we cannot commercialize them or we have to go seek the rights to those third-party rights. Plasmids being an obvious example of that. So yeah, research tools, I mean, it adds up over time and it's perpetual income. But, Karthik can speak to that later. I think he's got some points to comment on how we manage disclosures in our office.
Yeah, actually to that point, one of our viewers is interested, if anyone's willing to share some more detail about the financial incomes of your initiatives. Karthik will go over in a few minutes, general revenue distribution, but in your own words, if you'd like to share. Maybe not. Anybody?
We can go to the other questions that were asked, Brianna.
Yeah, actually, so I think that covers everything. If Sat and Scott, you've got your panel questions covered. And thank you so much for the panel for sharing your stories. That's really great insight and certainly showcases how there's not just one way to bring your research to market and drive real impact in the community. So, okay, so we still got a little bit of time. We're gonna switch gears a bit. And we noticed that of the questions that were submitted beforehand, many really centered on the innovation process, generally speaking, and how to engage with our team. So some of these processes have actually improved significantly over recent months. So our director, Karthik, is now going to walk us through an overview. So first question, Karthik, what inventions or ideas am I required to disclose?
So because these questions were kind of given to us in advance, I think we have a slide kind of addressing that. But generally, the idea is the disclosure is just one of the steps in the process. I mean, it really is, it could be the first step, but it could be the second or third or fourth step, because what we would really like is for us to engage constantly and continually. And a couple of the investigators here talked about, Ashita and Pete in particular, they talked about how they were just doing what they do, what they're employed to do, and what they're having fun with as research investigators, and not really thinking about or caring about the money aspect of it. So what our expertise is and what we bring to the table is the ability to recognize the commercial potential or impact that some of these research ideas may have. And we have a reasonable process in place now that seems to be working pretty well, where we quickly, within a short time, come back with a commercial analysis of what this invention could mean in the marketplace. And in working in conjunction with you, we try to find the best home for it if that's the appropriate thing to do. So I guess the bottom line is talk to us early and often.
Great. Thank you, Karthik. Okay, next question. What happens after I disclose my intellectual property?
Sure. Again, another question which we had the opportunity to make a slide around. So this is a typical kind of a graphic that you might see in any website affiliated with technology transfer. It starts with research, disclosure, evaluation, marketing, societal impact, and then obviously, as you have elaborated, all the panelists have elaborated, some of the money comes back and goes back into the research enterprise, which allows the lights to be kept on in some cases. However, as Brianna mentioned, some of these processes have been streamlined since I joined UAB and improved. And what has changed is the engagement that we have with our faculty. So as soon as an invention disclosure is now submitted to our office, within 30 days, we will provide to you a 4 to 6 page document which details the commercial impact or potential commercial impact that your invention can have. It may be that there is no commercial impact, or it may be there's significant commercial impact, and that document is a talking point, is a way to engage with our faculty. So because we're not going to get everything right, because this is not our field typically, and you are the scientists, you are the experts, but it provides an opportunity for us to engage with you and make a decision together as to what the appropriate next steps are. And if we do decide to patent it or copyright it or protect it in any other form, then we will of course market it. And then in engagement with you, because again, you're the experts, you have the connections, request your assistance in identifying appropriate licensing partners. And then of course, our expertise certainly lies in striking reasonable deals commensurate with the value of the technology with our partners, so that it could lead to societal impact, and then the cycle continues. So that's what happens. But the early part is pretty intensive in terms of interaction with you to make this decision, as well as there is a reasonable amount of time that, especially if there's a patent involved, that your input would be solicited in helping us negotiate or work with the United States Patent and Trademark Office for the patent to be issued. I guess I'll stop there.
Right. I think we have one more slide on revenue distribution. Do you want to walk us through us just an overview, Karthik?
Sure, of course. So this is something which many inventors are likely familiar with. I want to make sure that I represent reasonably that our office administers this policy. We have had not much input into the making of this policy, and the second column here, which is the Inventor Share, has been pretty consistent over the last decade and a half. And I might also add that it is not different from or significantly different from our peer institutions that we typically benchmark ourselves with. So as it says here, if we get any money, we first reimburse ourselves for any expenses that we may have incurred, and then the net revenue is then shared in the bigger table below that, which is up to $20,000. The inventors get 75% of the share. The departments also get to share some. The schools get some, and UABRF gets some too. And sometimes the department uses its share to either plow it back to the inventor's laboratory or to set up other opportunities to enable other inventors in their department to further their research or further their innovative potential. But that changes from department to department. Again, we don't control that. That depends on the departmental chair. But otherwise, personally, to the inventors, they themselves receive in their pockets, along with their paycheck, presumably, the share as described below. And again, the biggest number there, the plus two, if we receive more than $2 million to distribute, the 30% number there is certainly very, very comparable to peer institutions.
Great, thank you. Hey, I'm a UAB faculty member and I have an idea for a startup company. Where do I start?
So as Brianna mentioned in the very beginning, this is a seminar series, one of two, and our next webinar series is going to be around startups. And that event is going to be on July 15th at 1 p.m. And those questions will be answered very much more fully and elaborately in that forum. That is quite a different process compared to a simple licensing because of the policies within UAB and also Alabama state law. So UAB has put together a couple of committees to help our faculty and us navigate all of the legalese associated with starting a new company. But you'll hear all about that in our upcoming event. Also, to the left of the slide, you see that for would-be, wannabe entrepreneurs, we have a whole link dedicated to what's called a startup guide, which kind of goes into the gory details, if you really want to read all of that, into what it takes. And it's a very, very well fleshed out, robust document, but I think you'll gain a lot from just kind of listening in on the webinar on July 15th. Having said that, I just want to go back to the previous slide and make the point that it may appear to be that, yeah, thank you, that UABRF gets a lot of money. If you look at the last column, some of you might wonder why I chose to skip that, because we are also a significant beneficiary of the talent and inventiveness of our faculty. And I don't want to hide behind that. I really want to address that up front. We get very minimal support from UAB as an institute. So we are mostly self-sustaining. And so the powers that be that set up UABRF well before any of us in the department right now set this structure up to ensure that we can be a viable self-sustaining organization. So again, that last column also had nothing to do with any of us in the office currently, but it was established a long time ago. Just want to make sure that's recognized. So I think we have come to the last slide, and unless there are any more questions, Brianna, that have since popped up in the chat, I'd just like to, are there any questions, Brianna?
No, it looks like we've covered everything.
Okay, great. So I'd like to take this opportunity to give profound thanks to CTL for providing us with this platform and an opportunity to engage with the UAB community of inventors. Obviously, significant thanks also to the panelists for taking the time to share with us the journey of their inventions and kind of the behind the scenes story about how these inventions came to be and the timeline. I mean, one thing that we noticed today was inventions happen in the early 2000s, but they're just about beginning to get approval now, at least for exclusive licenses. And on the other hand, inventions that have been invented from, or for example, John Carney, and Pete, images and inventions that have been invented a long, long time ago continue to kind of prolifically impact even today. So there's a time component to this in terms of it takes too long or it takes too short, but it just depends on the invention. And the reason we carefully chose these specific panelists to participate in this, and again, thank you again for participating, is that the concepts that they represent, their inventions represent, they represent a significant spectrum of the technologies broadly defined as intellectual property in the broadest sense that can be monetized. So we chose different kinds of technologies to kind of showcase what may have monetary potential. And to Pete and Ashita's point, sometimes the inventors may not recognize that their inventions have monetary potential. I alluded to this as well before. So please, please, please engage with us and help us help you figure out if your invention or your idea may have a commercial impact. We hope that you will engage with HI to explore all of these. And it does not need to be formal. It can just start off with an email. But if you want to start off with submitting an IPD and feel that is the easiest way to work with us, we are significantly lowering the bar by streamlining our IPD form. And within a couple of weeks, we're going to have an online form that is going to be launched. So please stay tuned for that. And for the reminder again that we have a startup webinar next month. So we'd love to see you all there. Thank you for joining us and have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you.
Bye. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks all.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.